Father, Father, I thank you for this time, that we can open your word, that we can walk through this text together. Lord, I pray that you would allow it to teach us. But Lord, I pray that as we walk through this passage, I pray that we would be emboldened to stand with you. Lord, as we see Peter fail to do so, and as we watch those around Jesus bring these false accusations against him, Lord, I pray that we would see what's happening, and that as a result of that, we would stand with you, even when it's hard, even when the world is clearly against you. Lord, I pray that we would stand with Jesus. So, Father, I pray that you would use this time to embolden us, and we pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Well, just as Elizabeth read, I hope that you see we are getting closer and closer and closer to the cross. We are nearing the crucifixion, and a lot is going on. So what I wanted to do, because we are almost done with 26 of the 28 chapters of Matthew, it's crazy. We only have 2 chapters left. We've only been here for like a year and a half. So I thought it would be good just to slow down for a minute, take a quick snapshot of where we've been and where we're going. Of course, I hope you know how the story ends, and I'm going to spoil it if you don't. Jesus comes back from the dead. So just a quick snapshot of where we've been would be good before we get to today's text, because if we stop and we remember who this is, it changes our perspective a little bit. Jesus is this guy who's done all of these miracles. He's taught crowds, and now he's selected these specific followers who have been following him around for a couple of years, learning from him, learning from his teaching, and then doing incredible things in his power. Okay? Now we've come to Jerusalem, to the final week of Jesus' life before his crucifixion. We're here in the final week. He's come into Jerusalem, and as he did, he came riding on a donkey, you remember? And then we talked about how that was Jesus' way of declaring that he was this peaceful, triumphant king over Israel. How he's this king entering Jerusalem. And as he entered, he came in, went to the temple, he denounced the religious leaders, told of the destruction of the temple, and he told them of his second coming, and then told some cool parables, which I thought were interesting. Then, what we talked about last couple weeks was Jesus taking his guys, his inner circle, to a room. He reminded them of what was going to happen, that he was going to go, he was going to suffer and die, a reality that they seem to have yet to grasp. And he instituted this thing that we call communion, or the Lord's Supper. He instituted this with his guys. And then just last week, we saw that one of his guys, one of those 12, betrayed him, gave him over to the Gentiles, one of his closest friends. And Jesus told them, I know that every one of you is going to fall away too. All of you will. And one by one, they denied it. Not me. Even if I have to die, Peter, I love Peter. Peter's the best. Even if I have to die with you, I will never turn away. Never fall away. Then Jesus goes to the garden and he prays. And he asks God, if it's possible, remove the cup from me. But he also prays that it's not his will, but God's will that's done. And it's heavy, heavy stuff. Heavy stuff. But as I had taken this close reading of Matthew, even in my own study, it seems to be coming to the forefront again and again that Jesus is passionate about what God wants. Passionate about making God's glory known. Which part of the title to this series, this passion, and we see that he is passionate about it. And that's his purpose, isn't it? That's his purpose. But again, our goal is, as we walk through this, not only to see who Jesus is, but then show us how that impacts who we are and how his purpose impacts ours. So as I've taken this close reading, I've watched Jesus get closer and closer to completely fulfilling his purpose and bringing our purpose more clearly into focus. So as Matthew writes this, we learn some things about Jesus and his relationship to the world. Now, if we're learning something about Jesus and his relationship to the world, we should know that that's going to inform us something about our relationship to the world. So that's what we're finding here. We're going to find what the world thinks of Jesus and how difficult it is for his followers because the world's going to think some things about them. And it's going to be difficult for his followers. And we see that play out today. The world thinks something about Jesus, so it's hard for his followers. My aim today is not to be downcast. My aim isn't just to be all heavy today. Actually, I hope that by the end of this time you are encouraged. And like I prayed just a moment ago, I hope that you're emboldened by the time we're done with this. I hope that you are lit up because, and again, maybe it's just because of how I'm feeling. Last week, y'all were here, and I wasn't feeling great, y'all. Like Kleenex box on the pulpit. I feel good this week, so y'all are in for it now. Hopefully that perks you up just a little bit because I feel great. So my goal is to encourage you today. I hope that you're going to be strengthened and more prepared to share the hope that you have in Jesus with those around you. And the way that I want to do that is to do what we've done a lot here lately, to walk through this text and kind of mark it up as we go. And hopefully I'm hoping that will encourage you. Am I not? Hey, looky there. We are broadcasting. All right. Okay. So we're going to walk through the text. At the end, we're going to boil this down to a couple of different parts, and hopefully you see why and how I want you to be emboldened. But the text that we're about to walk through has two really obvious main sections, okay? And I love the way this plays out because we see these two main threads running through here, and one's more dominant than the other, okay? So we have this first main thread of this story that's running through what Matthew's writing here, and that's what's happening with Jesus. Right? So we're watching Jesus as he goes into this trial, or I'm going to put that in air quotes just so you know, the trial before the high priest. Okay, so we see that main thread running here, but we see a second one come in too, and that's what's going on with Peter. Okay, so we see these two, but the reason I think it's important that we see both of these today is because what we find is these two threads that are running through here are so intertwined that they cannot be separated. Peter, as one of Jesus' closest followers, his life, his narrative cannot be separated from Jesus. They interact so closely that in order to understand what's going on with Peter, you have to understand what's going on with Jesus. Okay? So we're going to walk through these. We're going to see first and primarily Jesus and his trial before Caiaphas, the high priest, but we're also going to see Peter's denials. Okay? So let's look at this trial. Verse 57. It says, "Those who had arrested Jesus led him away to this guy named Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had convened." All right. Now, we've seen something similar to this happen already. Actually, here in this chapter, we've seen something similar to this already. If you rewind back to verse 3 of chapter 26, you find that they are in the courtyard of the high priest. Okay, it's like the same scene. And there in verse 3, the chief priests and the elders, they assembled in the courtyard of the high priest who was named Caiaphas. And this first time that they gathered, back in verse 3, they were conspiring to arrest Jesus in a treacherous way and to kill him. So their aim was to arrest Jesus and then to kill him, right? Y'all tracking with me, right? Okay. Now they're gathered here again because the first part of that task has been accomplished. They've arrested Jesus, and that's what we saw last week. They arrested him in a treacherous way. They paid off one of his closest friends to betray him. So now they've arrested Jesus, and they bring him here again because now they have one goal left. And what is that one goal? They want to kill him. They want Jesus dead. So they bring him back where the scribes and the elders had convened. They're all gathered here. Okay, so now we get to verse 58. It says, Peter, and again, here's our second thread, Peter was following him at a distance, right to the high priest's courtyard. He went in and he was sitting with the servants to see the outcome. So here's Peter, this second storyline, following Jesus along. Now, remember, Peter's not the main story. Jesus is the main story, but Peter has a role to play here. Okay, so we find Peter following him along, and I just picture this like cartoons where they're like walking along, and you got this big guy, and he tries to hide behind this little skinny post or something, and you can still see him. That's how I picture Peter following him along, just trying to hide as he's moving, and maybe that's a bad analogy, because he's following, and it says very clearly, following at a distance. He doesn't want to be seen because he knows he'll be recognized with Jesus, so he's keeping his space. He's tailing him from a distance, like 4 cars back or something like that, so he's not recognized. So here he is following him along, but give him some credit, right? He wants to see the outcome. He wants to see what's going to happen to this guy he's devoted his life to. He wants to know. Now, if you're like me, you are super harsh on Peter. Super harsh with Peter. And rightfully so, right? The guy's about to betray Jesus. He said, I'm going to be with you even if I have to die. And now Jesus is in his moment of need where he could really use a friend. And where's Peter? Saying, I don't even know the guy. So we're going to be really hard on Peter. But let's give him just a little bit of credit, okay? I read one commentator this week who pointed out that at least Peter followed. He cared about what happened with Jesus. He wanted to know the outcome. And at some point, he does remember the words Jesus said. They argue that Peter is still showing faith, even if it's a very weak and superficial faith. So, let's give Peter a little bit of credit. He wants to know what's going to happen. But he follows, but he doesn't want to be recognized or identified as being with Jesus. Okay? So here's Peter following him along. Verse 59. The chief priests, and the whole Sanhedrin. This word whole is going to be an interesting one here in just a minute. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false testimony against Jesus. But why? Here it is. So that, and mark that thing in bold, so that they could put him to death. They had one goal in mind, right? One goal. Nothing else was going to be good enough. They wanted him put to death. And notice, again, like I told you, this word whole is going to be an interesting one. The whole Sanhedrin. Now, what is the Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin is kind of like the Supreme Court of ancient Israel. That's the closest analogy I can draw. Like they are the highest law in the land. They make decisions where nobody else can. And it's interesting because this word Sanhedrin, it actually goes back to other local assemblies. Like there could be other local courts. Any town or village that had 120 male heads of household would have a Sanhedrin, an assembly or a gathering that would oversee the local issues. But the Sanhedrin we're talking about here is not one of these small local assemblies. This is what became known as the Great Sanhedrin. They were ruling over the nation of Israel, and they only met in Jerusalem, and they had authority that other local assemblies did not have. They could do things that others couldn't. So this is the Great Sanhedrin. And it was comprised of 70 members, which I believe we see some of, the chief priests. But then it also has a 71st, some would say 72nd, because the high priest was also a member of the Sanhedrin. That gives you 71, or at least it should, but there's a whole mess with the chief priests here. So we're not going to get into that. So here they are, 71. And it says the whole Sanhedrin. Does that mean that all of them were here in the middle of the night? That's a fun question. And I don't think it does. And I'll explain why. The whole Sanhedrin was looking for a reason to kill Jesus. All of them wanted him dead, to a person. They wanted him dead and out of the way. The whole Sanhedrin was looking for false testimony so that they could put him to death. But that does not necessarily mean every one of them was gathered here at night. But I do think that what Matthew is telling us is that there were enough there that they could make a decision. To have a quorum amongst the Sanhedrin, 23 members had to be present. 23. So I believe that you've got 23 guys together here in the middle of the night, ready to hear what Jesus has to say, all of them wanting him dead. To a man, wanting him dead and out of the way. And that's why this "so that" right here is so important. They wanted to put him to death. That's what they were after. That was their aim. Nothing else would do. And we see that more and more as we get into this. So let's keep going. But they could not find any. Remember, they're looking for false testimony. They could not find any, even though many false witnesses. Okay, now remember, false. They were looking for false testimony. Where do you find false testimony? False witnesses. So many false witnesses came forward. Many of them came to him. And they still couldn't find any problems. Does that mean that they couldn't find anything to charge Jesus with? Any accusation to bring against Jesus from these false witnesses? No. Actually, they'd already accused him of a lot of things, hadn't they? If you think back to the narrative, they've accused Jesus of associating with Gentiles and sinners. They've accused him of breaking the Sabbath. They've accused him of a whole host of other things. They've brought accusations against him. But what they couldn't find was testimony which would convict Jesus of a capital crime that would make him eligible for the death penalty. They couldn't find anything because that was their aim. They wanted Jesus dead, not just out of the way. They wanted him gone. He's caused a problem for them now. So they start looking for this false testimony so they could bring this capital crime or this capital charge against him. And they couldn't find any, despite many false witnesses, which, by the way, should teach us something. Whenever we get to the New Testament, it starts talking about the role of elders and overseers. It says that they must be, oh goodness, I just went totally blank. Above reproach. That's the word I'm looking for. Must be above reproach. And Jesus teaches us something about being above reproach here. You can bring accusations, but none of them stick. They're looking with many false witnesses, many of them trying to bring false testimony, but nothing sticks. Nothing does. Jesus is above reproach. So we learned something there. But notice false testimony comes from these false witnesses. And Matthew's emphasizing, by using this word false twice, he's emphasizing that this hearing is a sham. It was biased from the beginning. They're not looking to get to the truth. They have no desire to get to the truth. See, these men, before they heard a shred of evidence, before they heard any testimony, they were already convinced that Jesus was guilty. Convinced that he was guilty. So nothing that they heard would be sufficient until they got the evidence they wanted. They're not looking for right evidence. They're looking for what they want. So we keep going here in verse 60. I got the wrong tool going here. It says, finally, two. This is important. Two who came forward stated, this man said, I can destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Now, let's break this apart for just a second, okay? There's two of them that come. Why does Matthew think it's so important to say there's two? Well, because in a capital case, according to the laws of ancient Israel, a capital case, you had to have at least two witnesses. So there's two who come here bringing these accusations. We may miss that, but that word two is incredibly important to a first century Jewish audience who would hear this and say, oh, they have the witnesses needed to put him to death. They have what they need in this capital case. Okay? So then we get to the specific testimony that they gave. And let's look at this carefully, because they say that they heard Jesus say these words, I can destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. My question whenever I read that was, is this really false testimony? Is this false testimony? I think that's a tricky question to answer, because it doesn't seem to be to me anyway. John chapter 2, verses 18 and 19. Here's what it says. It says, so the Jews replied to him, what sign will you show us for doing these things? Jesus answered, listen carefully, destroy this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days. The accusation they're bringing is that he said, I can destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. That sounds pretty close. Now, it may not be word for word, but it sounds pretty close. Okay. Further, just a few days earlier from what we're reading here in Matthew, back in chapter 24, verse 2, Jesus said, truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here on another that will not be thrown down. Now, we know that in John's passage, we know Jesus was talking about his body, right? He was saying this temple, his body would be destroyed. He'd build it back up in 3 days. That's what he's talking about. And in Matthew 24, Jesus doesn't say that he's going to destroy anything, only that it will be destroyed. And he doesn't say a word about it being rebuilt. So, in my opinion, the testimony they have in mind here is what's said over in John chapter 2. That seems to be the most consistent. John chapter 2. Okay. Now, if that's the case, is this false testimony? I would argue it is. Now, it's close to the same. Jesus said something similar, but Jesus' words are being taken grossly out of context. Grossly out of context, and they are definitely being misunderstood. So is this false testimony? I would argue it is. It's quite a leap to take his statement in John chapter 2 as a threat against the nation of Israel. That's a pretty significant leap. Okay. But why is this the charge? This seems to be the one that gets the Sanhedrin's attention. Why is this the one? Not only because it has two witnesses, but why this one? Why is this worthy of the death penalty? D.A. Carson kind of helped me figure this out. He said desecration of sacred places was almost universally regarded as a capital offense in the ancient world. And in this, Jews were no different from the pagans. Any kind of threat of desecration against a holy space in the ancient world, that was a capital offense. And the nation of Israel was the same way. A threat against the temple was a threat against the nation, which is a capital offense. So that's why they bring this charge. They bring this charge against Jesus. Let's keep going. Verse 62. There he says, the high priest stood up and said to him, don't you have an answer to what these men are testifying against you? Don't you have an answer? And of course they want an answer. Makes sense, right? Don't you have an answer to what they're charging you? But I love what he says, or what happens here. Verse 63, this fun word, but. Don't you have an answer? But Jesus kept silent. Jesus didn't say anything. Okay, why does that really matter? Well, because what Jesus is doing is fulfilling Scripture. And some of you catch this. Some of you are like, oh, I get it. Some of you are like, why does that really matter? Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7. This is part of Isaiah's description of the suffering servant, which was almost always considered a messianic text. There, he says that he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, and like a sheep silent before her shearers, he did not open his mouth. And what does Jesus do is he has all of these around him wanting to kill him, put him to death, bringing these accusations against him, misunderstanding him. What's he do? Keeps silent. He keeps silent. He's doing exactly what God said he would do through his prophet. Jesus, by keeping this silence, is saying, I am this suffering servant. I am the Messiah. He's showing it through his actions. So the high priest says to him, 63, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Essentially what the high priest just said to him here is, just come out with it already. Quit keeping us in suspense. If you are the Messiah, if you are the Son of God, just say it so that we can charge you with blasphemy, we can put you to death, and we can move on with this thing. Like, just say it already. I love that Jesus doesn't just say it, but he might as well. Verse 64, he says, you have said it. You have said it, Jesus says. But I tell you, and by the way, this word you is plural, so Jesus isn't just talking to the high priest here, he's talking to the whole Sanhedrin. He says, but I tell you, in the future, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. So what's happening here is Jesus says something he's already told his disciples, but now he's not hiding it at all. He's saying it openly and publicly. And Carson, he actually called this Jesus' climactic self-disclosure to the authorities. And he says it combines revelation with threat. He says, yeah, I'm the Messiah, the Son of God. You just said it, and someday you're going to see me. You're going to see me, the Son of Man, right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven. Just like he told his disciples he was going to. Jesus is not only telling him, I'm the Messiah, but now he's telling him, you're going to have to deal with judgment in the future. You're going to have to deal with God coming on the clouds of heaven. The Son of Man coming. You're going to have to deal with that. And notice he doesn't leave any room for doubt. There's like you might see me coming in the future, or you will only see it in the future. No, he says you will see the Son of Man. There's no doubt they're going to have to deal with that. They're going to see him coming in his power. And he goes on. Verse 65. Then the high priest tore his robes and says, he has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? See, now you've heard the blasphemy. You've heard the blasphemy. Now, why would they need any outside witnesses at this point? Jesus essentially just claimed to be the Son of God. They've heard all that they needed to hear. But the only way this is blasphemy is if Jesus isn't who he's claiming to be, right? Because if he is who he's claiming to be, it's just telling the truth. That's not blasphemy. So again, we find that these people, they are assuming that he is not, rather than inspecting the evidence for themselves. By the way, this is a side note. I didn't put this in my notes, but if you ever start thinking something about Jesus and you're like, okay, is he who he says he is he not? I encourage you, look at the evidence. And I think if you give the evidence an honest chance, I think you'll find that Jesus is exactly who he claims to be. Exactly who he's claiming to be here. Okay, so he says, there's no need to inspect the evidence any further. He just said all this right here out in the open. So in verse 66, they call for a decision to be made, right? He says, what is your decision? And they answered, he deserves death. He deserves death. This word deserve is a fun one. In other words, it means that he is subject to or he is worthy of death. And they believe that this quote-unquote blasphemy, claiming to be the Son of God, they believe that it is worthy of death. But let's remember, this was their goal in this sham trial from the very beginning. They wanted to bring these false witnesses so that they could put him to death. They didn't need the evidence. They already had their mind set on what they were going to do. They were just looking for a reason to do it. They had their minds made up before anything happened. And now they have Jesus exactly where they think they want him. So we get to verse 67. Verse 67. Look how they treat Jesus. Then they spat in his face and beat him. Others slapped him. And then you find them mocking him, saying, prophesy to us, Messiah. Who was it that hit you? All the while, Jesus is seemingly silent. Doesn't give them anything in return. Again, this silent sufferer. Silent before those who would eventually put him to death. And something interesting happens here because I told you we have these two threads running through this passage. Here there's like this abrupt scene shift. We've been following Jesus along. Peter seems to be hiding in the background, and they were following Jesus along, and all this happening with the sham trial. But in verse 69, we get this kind of dramatic shift back to Peter. Okay? And here we find Peter's denials. And y'all, hopefully you know what happened. Elizabeth read it just a few minutes ago. But let's walk through this. Verse 69. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl approached him and said, you were with Jesus the Galilean too. You were with Jesus the Galilean too. Now, Matthew goes out of his way to point out that this is a servant girl. One, because she would have been there, but two, to show her standing in society. This servant girl wouldn't have had much standing in society. Okay? But she sees Peter here at nighttime in this courtyard, outside in the courtyard. And given the commotion of this sham trial taking place in the middle of the night, she sees Peter, recognizes him, and approaches him. And she calls him out for being with Jesus. Notice that's the accusation. You were with Jesus. Okay, so she recognizes that he had been traveling with Jesus. She recognized him for who he was. But there is something that we might miss because of our context that would have been understood in Matthew's context. She says, you were with Jesus the Galilean. The Galilean. Okay, we read that and we don't think anything of it, but calling him Jesus the Galilean would have almost been like using a derogatory term because of the way the Nazarenes or Galileans were viewed in Jerusalem. She's insulting him without insulting him, is kind of what's happening here. It's kind of like putting Jesus and Peter, both Jesus and Peter down because of where they're from. It's like saying, well, yeah, Jared's one of those guys from Oregon. And I get it because I think things about you Mount Cityans. At least you're not Craigers. Now that you're all insulted. Seriously, though, I hope you get the sarcasm. I really don't care where you're from. Like, it's irrelevant. I genuinely don't care where you're from. It's whatever. By the way, people are people no matter where they're at, and they all have their problems. So if you view Mount Cityans, Oregonites, boy, that sounds weird. Craigers, wherever you're from, I really don't care. Sinners are sinners, and they all need the grace of God. Okay? But it's like she's recognizing them, saying, you were with Jesus the Galilean. But that's what this girl's doing. She's putting him down, thinking that she is superior to Jesus and to Peter because of where she's from. She says, I know who you are. You were with Jesus the Galilean. I hope you can almost hear the tone, like the way that she's trying to put him down with the words. Verse 70. How is Peter going to respond to this? You already know the answer, but he denied it. He denied it. Not only did he deny it, he denied it in front of everyone, saying, I don't know what you're talking about. What Peter's denying is that he was with Jesus, right? Because that was the accusation. You were with Jesus the Galilean. And he denied it in front of everyone. He does it openly and publicly. And by the way, if you're numbering these in your Bible, go ahead and put a number 1 by that one, because this is the first time that this happens here. But he says, no, I want it to be clear. I want it to be heard by everybody around that I was not with Jesus. Let's keep going. See what happens. Verse 71. When he had gone out to the gateway, another woman, and by the way, Matthew points out it was another woman, who saw him and told those who were there, this man was with Jesus the Nazarene. Very similar to the first accusation, isn't it? This man was with Jesus the Nazarene. Very similar scene. And calls him out in front of everybody again. Well, this guy, he was with Jesus, wasn't he? Verse 72. Verse 72. Again, he denied it with an oath. I don't know the man. Okay, this time he denies it with an oath. Some of your translations say he might have sworn. Now, it doesn't mean he's swearing or using foul language or anything. It means that he's calling an oath against himself. And if he's lying, that means he's calling a curse down on himself for lying. That's what's being indicated here. Peter says, of course I didn't know the guy. No, it's of course we know he is lying, which means he's calling a curse down on himself, isn't he? But you see the increase in the force of this denial. Now he's saying, not only was I not with him, I didn't even know the man. And if I'm lying to you, I call a curse down on me from heaven. Peter is upping the ante a little bit here. We get to verse 73. After a little while, those standing there approached and said to Peter, you really are one of them, since even your accent gives you away. And at this point, I thought about using a whole bunch of funny accents because, boy, I got all sorts of voices in my head. So I started thinking about using these accents that would get the point across. But you guys understand, like accents from different places. We lived in Fort Worth for a time, and while we were there, you heard accents from all over the place. You'd hear these southern accents. And by the way, words mean different things to different people. If you go down to the South, Coke is any kind of pop, which is not right. It should either be pop or soda, and I understand those things, but you say Coke, I want a Coke. Anyway, you guys, whatever. You get it. An accent gave him away. He says, we know who you are. We know who you are. We can hear your accent. You must be from Galilee. You must be one of them. And they call him out in front of everyone again. And then in verse 74, what's Peter do? Then he started to curse and to swear with an oath, I don't know the man. By the way, this one would be number 3. I missed number 2 back there. Here's number 3. And the intensity again picks up. And this time he starts swearing and calling curses down on himself if he's lying. And I don't know the specific language that Peter's using, but I imagine it's colorful at this point. He starts calling these curses down on himself. And doing so more and more emphatically. But then something astounding happens, right? The end of verse 74 says, immediately a rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the words Jesus had spoken. Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. I hope you get this scene, right? Jesus says, you're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. Peter denies him 3 times, and guess what happens? The rooster crows. And it's like an alarm bell going off in Peter's head saying, I just did exactly what I swore I wouldn't do. I swore I wouldn't. And here I am. I am this betrayer, this liar, this weak person who walked away from the one who gave me everything, who taught me, who we saw his power. We know who this man is, and I walked away from him. And if you're anything like Peter, you would do the exact same thing he did. The very end of verse 75 here, he went outside and he wept bitterly. Pretty dramatic fashion. Peter denies Jesus. And whenever it says that he wept, that word, it means that he expressed an uncontainable, audible grief. Peter's fault was obvious to him. And he just let it out. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I haven't been exactly where Peter is, but I've felt this before. Knowing what I'd promised not to do. Knowing what I promised I would never go back to. Promising that I would never turn away from Jesus again in the same way. And then it happens again. And I feel the weight of my shame. My guilt. And I know what's happened. Something reminds me of my own guilt. And there's nothing left to do but cry and say, I know I failed. Y'all ever felt that before? It's not a fun feeling. It's not pleasant. But Peter is feeling grief here. And if we just stopped right now, y'all wouldn't leave feeling encouraged or emboldened, would you? No, that's pretty heavy stuff. But we're to the end of our text for today. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take these 19 verses. We're going to boil them down to one overarching theme. And I think that overarching theme that we find here is the way the world interacts with Jesus. Or the way the world matches up with Jesus, the way they feel about Jesus. And we find that here. And I think that these 2 scenes that we find, these 2 threads, they bring us 2 lessons on how the world relates to Jesus and his followers. okay? And I hope that after you see these, you are somewhat encouraged and you are emboldened to make a stand with Jesus. We find that Peter failed, but I want you to be able to stand, okay? The first one of these lessons we find, the world will see in Jesus what it has already decided about Jesus. Okay, and I'm going to read that again because prepositions are important, okay? The world will see in Jesus what it has already decided about Jesus. Let me explain what I mean here, okay? I know most of y'all are pretty sharp people, okay? And I'm not just saying that trying to puff you up. I know most of you, if I came around and said, do you think that you have a lot of answers, you're probably going to be humble and you're going to say, no, I got a lot left to learn. I know that's how you're going to be, but I know most of y'all, you guys know some stuff. I'm not saying you know everything, but you know some stuff, okay? And as you've considered the Christian faith in light of the prevailing culture or the cultural opinion, you've asked yourself, like, how do you not get it? Like, y'all ever felt that way? Like, you've looked at the world and the brokenness in the world and you've tried to tell them, like, Jesus is the solution, and they just don't get it. Like, you ever been there before? Like, why don't you understand? Like, why can't you just see that you need Jesus? You're broken and nothing that you're trying is ever seeming to help you at all. Like, you've tried all the different stuff and nothing seems to get you beyond the brokenness that you're experiencing. Why can't you see that you need Jesus? I've given you all the answers, all the evidence. I've shown you the truth and I've shown you your flaws in your current worldview. Why won't you just convert and follow Jesus? Like, it just makes sense. Why won't you do that? Have you ever felt that frustration before? Like, why don't you get it? Y'all ever felt that? Or am I alone? Amen. Okay, you get it. You get it. I think there's an easy answer to that question, though. Why don't you get it? The answer, you can go read Romans 1:18 on your own, but there Paul is talking about how his invisible attributes have been made obvious in creation. But people don't know God because, he says, they suppress the truth. The reason people don't get it is really because there's something in them that doesn't want to get it. They have suppressed the truth. It's not because there's not enough evidence. There's plenty of evidence. The reason is they've suppressed it. What am I trying to tell you? The problems people have in submitting to Jesus has never been an issue of evidence. It has never been an issue of evidence. I don't believe it is. The problem people have in submitting to Jesus is that they believe about him exactly what they want to believe about him. They've suppressed the truth. The truth is that you can submit or that you can present all the evidence, and unless God convinces someone of the truth, they will never believe the truth. By the way, I know that sounds pretty harsh, right? Like, that's not encouraging or emboldening. Like, that doesn't embolden us at all. That's like, why should we even bother then? We can't do anything. Does that mean we should just stop sharing? No, you keep on sharing, removing as many obstacles as you possibly can. Give them the evidence you've got. Absolutely. Present the evidence. Sure. But what we need to do is we need to humbly and prayerfully recognize that only God can convince and only God can save. And the reason that's so important is what we talked about earlier. It takes all the pressure off of you. It's not up to you to save someone. You can't do that, actually. You have no power to do that. But God can still work through you to bring about his purposes. Isn't that incredible? Like, that just relieves all the pressure. I'll tell him what I know, and it's up to God to do the saving. Trust that God's going to do what God can do. Or maybe you aren't one of those people who thinks you have the answers, or maybe you're that person who says, you know what, I don't know enough to even start sharing the good news with people. Like, I don't know enough. Like, I'm not confident. I don't know. What if they ask me this? What if they ask me that? And I'm just here to tell you, even then, it's not a matter of knowing enough. It's still not a matter of knowing enough, because once you think you know enough, you're going to have more questions, and you're still not going to think you know enough. That makes sense, doesn't it? Some of you are like, no, that doesn't make sense. Some of you get it. Yeah, you're never going to know enough. It's not a matter of knowing enough. It's a matter of knowing God. Knowing the God that does have the answers. He's the one that can convince people of the truth. So share him, and he can open eyes. And again, grow in the knowledge that you have. Absolutely grow in the knowledge that God provides. But understand, you're never going to have all the answers. You just won't. And once you think you have all the answers, well, you need to go back to the Word, because you're going to find you don't have all the answers. So you just won't. just remember that the world, apart from God's supernatural work, will only see in Jesus what they've already decided about Jesus. What we need is to rely on God to open eyes to the truth. Make sense? Cool. Because that's what we find happens with Jesus. These men, they only wanted to see in Jesus what they'd already decided about him. And the only person that could change that is Jesus. He's the only one. So the world will see in Jesus what it's already decided about Jesus. Second lesson we learned is that it is difficult to stand with Jesus in the face of the world's decision about Jesus. It's difficult to stand with Jesus in light of the decision that they've made about Jesus. And some of you are like, I'm not scared. I'm going to follow Jesus no matter what, and I don't care what people think. I know some of you are thinking that. You're like, it's not difficult. Okay, Peter said the exact same thing. And guess what Peter did? 3 times. Yeah, he denied Jesus. He fell away. Instead of just saying like, nope, I got this. You can kill me if you need to. I'm not turning away. Instead, what we need to do is we need to humbly ask for the grace of God to stand rather than pretending we're headstrong and self-sufficient. Even Paul would later write in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. He said, he who thinks he stands must be careful not to fall. As soon as we think we're steady, we're standing here, we got this, that's about the time that we slip again. Instead, we need to continually go back to God, asking for his grace to stand, asking him for the power to stand. The reality is that it is difficult to stand with Jesus. Whether that's a result of persecution or teasing or a desire to appease people, it can be hard. It can be hard to stand with Jesus. And the Bible confirms that Jesus' followers will be charged with the same things that Jesus was. And the same deceptive tactics are going to be used. I think about Stephen in the book of Acts. Stephen is accused of pretty much the exact same thing as Jesus, in the exact same way as Jesus. Acts chapter 6, verse 11. Then they secretly persuaded some men to say, we heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God. And you know what happens to Stephen at the end of Acts chapter 7? Anybody know? Yeah, Stephen's stoned to death, in case you didn't know. Now, I'm not telling you that if you stand with Jesus, you're going to be stoned to death at the city gate. Probably not going to happen here in Mountain City. I haven't actually seen a gate in Mountain City or around Mountain City, so I don't know that that's what's going to happen. But what I want you to see is how the world has taken what Christians believe and twisted it to try to make the church look bad. Y'all ever seen that? If you haven't, I'll give you some examples. We believe in a biblical world or a biblical view of marriage. Okay? We believe in a biblical view of marriage. We believe that one man, one woman should be in a one flesh union for life. That's what we believe about marriage. Okay? That we think that the Bible teaches that. But believing that means that the world is going to say about us that we hate those who disagree with us. Right? That we think we're superior to them. You ever heard that before? So you think you're better than me. How about this one? We believe that men should lead their homes. Unashamedly believe that God created order in the home. But the world says that means that we teach that women are lesser beings. By the way, we don't teach that here. We believe that Jesus taught a literal resurrection of the dead and a bodily return of Christ. And the world says that means that we believe in fairy tales that our teaching should then be rejected. Y'all familiar with any of these? You ever heard any of those? Where what we believe has been twisted to make it sound like we're dumb? Y'all ever felt that way? You've been belittled for what you believe because you're clinging to what the Bible teaches. Listen, if you stand with Jesus, it will be difficult at times because the world has already made a decision about Jesus. It will be difficult sometimes. And I don't think the Bible pulls any punches on that. But here's what I can tell you without any doubt or any hesitation. God's grace is enough. God's grace is enough. Not only for your salvation in the end, but to provide strength for today. God's grace is enough. It's sufficient. I'm not here to tell you that it's always going to be easier or that the world will love you if you stand with Jesus. That's not it at all, because Jesus teaches exactly the opposite. It's going to be hard. And we see with Peter, it's difficult. It's hard to do that. But I can tell you that the good life and eternal life are found with Jesus. So today, I want you to be encouraged. Regardless of the world's assumptions about Jesus or about you, know that Jesus has overcome the world. He's overcome the struggles of the world. He's proven that he's victorious of it. He took the cross, he defeated death, and when we trust in his power, we too can walk in the newness of his life. Y'all, following Jesus, standing with Jesus, even though at times it's hard, it is worth it. And that's how I want to encourage you. That should embolden you, knowing that his goodness is enough. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank you. I thank you for your grace, because I know that we all, like Peter, have at times faded away or flat out denied you. Lord, but I know that just like you reinstate Peter, God, you've forgiven us. And I thank you for that. I thank you for that grace in my life. So, Lord, what I pray today is that as we see how the world interacted with Jesus and saw in him exactly what they wanted to see in him, and they sought out the evidence against him that they wanted, Lord, I pray that we would know that the same things are going to happen to us. Lord, I pray that you would open our eyes to that, but then you would also help us to know that it's only coming because of their brokenness. And Lord, I pray that you would give us the strength to be like Jesus and stand in the middle of that. Father, I pray that we would see those attacks coming and we would humbly ask you for more grace, for more strength, so that we might stand with Jesus. Lord, because that only happens by your grace. Father, what I'd ask today, above all else, is that you would convict us of sin, but then you would help us to have the strength to repent and to turn to you and to follow after you. Lord, I thank you that Jesus was silent before them, that he fulfilled the scriptures, that he died and he was raised again. Father, and I'm thankful that we can walk in the newness of life because of the grace you showed us in your Son. Lord, for that we thank you and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.